fledgling country, born out of revolution, determined to carve out a place for itself without the burden of colonial status. But how could this new nation build the basis for government that would avoid abuses of the past?
Gladstone, the British Prime Minister in the 19th century, he said that the American Constitution was the most remarkable work in modern times produced by the human intellect at a single stroke. Well, that is completely wrong. It is a remarkable instrument, but there was no single stroke. Our constitutional system, in its origins, went through phases which are very distinct. The first phase was in the early revolutionary years, where ideas drawn out of that complex that goes back into the early 18th century were mobilized to resist what they considered to be improper force used against them by the British government.
It becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature...
In 1774, the colonists met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress to define their demands of the British.
The representatives of the United States of America are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce.
The British world from which they largely, though not fully, derived, thought much of this was contemptible. And when they looked at a document like the Declaration of Independence, I mean, they found it almost laughable that these people would go on about inalienable rights, who had in captivity a quarter of the population, in slavery, etc. And the enumeration, the heart of the Declaration is an enumeration of the charges against George III, that these were in some ways acceptable practices of the time, in some ways self-contradictory, in some ways ridiculous. Nevertheless, these very provincial people had the self-confidence and the broad enough view of the world in general to believe, and rightly, that they were engaged in something of world historical importance.
Although the Declaration was a call to revolution rather than a framework for a new form of government, the ideas it contained, liberty, self-government, individual rights, lawful powers, were to become, 11 years later, the basis for the Constitution of the United States.
And this was a powerful kind of idealism at the time, incompatible with life as it was in the 18th century, but nevertheless a kind of soaring idealism about the capacity of the individual to achieve freedom, especially from government constraint. Opposition groups wrote profusely about what was wrong with this buildup of power at the heart of the British government. Those criticisms became the basis of what the Americans developed in the revolutionary period, and then later put into their own new creative constitutional and political organizations things that never took place in Britain.
The first government of the United States was based not on the Constitution, but on the Articles of Confederation adopted during the Revolutionary War.
The Articles of Confederation, which we almost never discuss anymore, is a very interesting document because there was no executive, there was no president. Congress was supposed to pass laws, and then the various cabinet members headed departments which carried out the law, so that this was in some ways the most libertarian or even anarchist government that has existed. It was a government that wasn't a government.
A third phase was, of course, the writing of the Federal Constitution in 1787, because the Articles of Confederation, which were no more than a government of conference, really, of independent states, which was adopted in 1781, was obviously ineffective. Everyone knew it was ineffective as a national instrument. So the third phase is the writing of the Constitution.
I think there are basically two sets of issues that help to explain how you get to the Federal Convention, or what I like to call the two roads to Philadelphia. There's one set of problems that we associate with the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And then there's a second set of issues associated with the problems of the states, taken not as part of a collective union, but really taken individually. For most of the 1780s, the basic agenda of reform for men like Madison, John Dickinson, Robert Morris, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, had meant to try to put together some kind of strategy that would enable the Articles of Confederation to be ratified in a kind of piecemeal way, and then to demonstrate that you could actually strengthen the national government without creating a tyranny on the other hand. And the problem with that strategy was that it could never overcome the basic hurdle of the requirement under the Articles of Confederation that all amendments had to be approved by a unanimous vote of the 13 state legislatures.
By 1784, the nation was unraveling. Congress was so weak that often members did not bother to attend. Finally, in late 1786, a revolt of farmers in western Massachusetts prompted leaders of the young nation to conclude that the government had to be changed.
And so finally that leads in 1786 to the expedient of calling it the Annapolis Convention. You know, it really is an independent body, not quite tainted the way Congress the Continental Congress was being tainted in terms of public perceptions in the 1780s. And the problem with Annapolis was that although 8 states had appointed commissioners to go there, only about a dozen guys from 5 states show up. So they don't really have enough of a quorum to do anything. But they wanted to, they didn't want to adjourn empty-handed, so they proposed a general convention to meet the following May.
Congress authorized the convention with the understanding that the Articles of Confederation would be revised. Leaders of the movement had other ideas in mind.
In Madison's thinking, in the months immediately leading up to Philadelphia in May 1787, is the recognition that the time has come not only to save Congress from the states, not only to enable the national government to act independently of the states, not to be dependent upon their compliance with all its recommendations and requisitions and resolutions and proposals and the like, but also to save the states from themselves. I mean, Madison felt this very passionately, and that conviction helped to convince him that when the convention finally was to meet in May 1787, it should have a pretty comprehensive agenda. It should not only propose additional powers for the national government, it should find some way to deal with problems of government within the states individually.
And just who were the people who were invited to attend the Constitutional Convention of 1787?
The framers were not a representative sample of the American population. There were 55 delegates who appear at the convention at one time or another. Some appear only for a matter of days or a couple of weeks. Most actually don't say anything that was recorded in Madison's notes. I mean, the bulk of the debate really falls to about a dozen to 15 speakers.
It is surprising, in fact, that they could collaborate as successfully as they did, given their very different backgrounds. I mean, the planter aristocracy from the slaveholding world of the South was very different from the New England 4th, 5th generation Puritans. But they managed to work together for certain purposes, and they were very, very different kinds of people. I mean, some of these people were extraordinarily learned for their time, and some of them were high moralists. And then some of them, like Franklin, were cunning pragmatists. But what they had in common, for our purposes anyway, is an enlightened concern for constructing governments they considered to be free, and free of the kinds of tyrannies that were so familiar in the European world.
Most of them had been involved at one time or other in the apparatus of the Revolution. They'd served in the Continental Congress. They'd served in state legislatures. They were planters. They were lawyers. They were merchants. They were men who had a pretty strong commitment to the revolutionary cause, men who had been fairly active, off and on throughout the revolutionary struggle. Some were younger, some were older. I mean, Franklin was the oldest. Franklin dies in 1790. And Madison at the time was a mere 36. In a sense, to kind of paraphrase John Kennedy, the torch had been passed to a new generation. They were a little bit less the prisoners of the past, a little more willing to reason on the basis of their experience. Perhaps that contributed to a certain innovation.
It's surprising that these provincials, and they were provincials, hidden out across the ocean from the metropolitan world, could think of themselves as doing something of this world historic significance. But they did think in this way, and they said so despite the fact that they were thought of in the metropolitan world as very provincial, doing things that would never survive, that ran against the principles of established governments and societies. Nevertheless, they were convinced that they were doing something of this monumental size. Where they got that confidence from, how they had the force of mind and self-esteem to be able to work in this way is something of a mystery.
As the convention neared, George Washington's involvement in the proceedings was uncertain.
Washington was Washington. I mean, he was, the most charismatic American of his generation, a statuesque figure, 6'4", against next to the diminutive Madison. He had enormous respect for all Americans. He was, for Madison, a real political asset. There's a kind of very interesting correspondence between Madison and Washington leading up to the convention. Washington was very reluctant to go to Philadelphia, and the general being the general, Madison had to be fairly delicate about how to deal with him. And at the same time, he was a great political asset. To have Washington's prestige attached to the convention would be, in itself, quite significant. But on the other hand, if the convention were to be a bust, the way the Annapolis Conference had been, back in September 1786, then, you would have wasted Washington's presence. Washington would not have been very happy. So Madison has this kind of delicate problem. He knows on the one hand it's really essential to have Washington there, and on the other hand he's a little bit worried about bringing him there too soon in case the thing's not going to pan out.
Monday, May 14th, 1787, was the day fixed for the meeting of the deputies in convention for revising the federal system of government. On that day, a small number only.
The likelihood of a quorum was still in question when the Virginia delegates arrived in Philadelphia.
7 states were not convened till May 25th, when the following members appeared: Massachusetts, Rufus King; New York, Robert Yates and Alexander Hamilton; New Jersey.
The other delegates were slow to arrive, so the Virginians are sitting around with nothing to do, so they write the Virginia plan, and enough delegates come in finally by the end of May 1787 that they had a quorum. And Washington's immediately elected president, though there's a bit of a boomlet for Benjamin Franklin. But Franklin was infirm and obviously could only have been a ceremonial president. Washington could actually preside.
And once they did arrive, just what kinds of challenges did the delegates face?
The difficulties the framers of the Constitution in their convention in 1788, the problems were enormous. And as I may have mentioned before, it's something of a miracle they were able to succeed. In the first place, they had to work out the principles of a written constitution. They were engaged in something that they had repudiated earlier, namely, they were creating a system of a central power, a government with sufficient powers to govern a vast territory.
Mr. Governor Morris explained the distinction between a federal and a national supreme government, the former being a mere compact resting on the good faith of the parties, the latter having a complete and compulsive operation. He contended that in all communities there must be one supreme power, and one only.
How do you do this and make it compatible with individual liberties and not make it excessive? How do you make a representative government, and this is the 18th century where the instruments of communication are so limited, how do you make a system of representation that would work effectively over an almost continental size? It made no sense in terms of theories of representation in the 18th century. So how do you do this?
It was resolved by the Committee of the Whole that a national government ought to be established, consisting of a supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary. Passed 6-1.
Debate at the convention began over the plan that had been devised by the Virginia delegation.
Madison and other large state delegates, Rufus King, Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, James Wilson, believed very much that representation in both houses of Congress should be apportioned on the basis of population, or of population and wealth. Against that position, the small state delegates, led by people like Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut and John Dickinson from Delaware, probably the 3 most important, William Patterson from New Jersey as well, The delegates from the smaller states argued that the states ought to be allowed to hold on to the right of equal representation, that's to say one state, one vote, or equal votes per state, that they enjoyed under the Articles of Confederation, where each state had one vote and one vote only. The debate all along, throughout the convention, was not of whether or not there would be apportionment in the lower house, but whether apportionment would be extended to the upper house.
Mr. Gerry, 4 modes of appointing the Senate have been mentioned. First, by the first branch of the national legislature. Government ought to flow from the people at large. If one branch of it should be chosen by the legislatures and the other by the people, the 2 branches will rest on different foundations, and dissensions will naturally arise between them. Fourthly, by the individual legislatures. Elections being carried through this refinement will be most likely to provide some check in favor of the commercial interest against the landed, without which oppression will take place, and no free government can last long where that is the case. He was therefore in favor of this last. Mr. Dickinson now moved that the members of the second branch ought to be chosen by the individual legislatures. Mr. Sherman seconded the motion, observing that the particular states would thus become interested in supporting the national government.
And that's why when you come down to the critical decision of July 16th, I mean, the vote on that day to give each state an equal vote in the Senate is 5 states to 4 with 1 state divided. And the state that was divided was Massachusetts, which is the 3rd most populous state, and therefore should be siding with the larger states. But Massachusetts was divided because its 4 delegates split, with Rufus King and Gorham voting for proportional representation for the Senate, and Elbridge Gerry, who I think is kind of the first real maverick in American political history, and Caleb Strong opting for the equal state vote.
The separate economic interests of northern and southern states became the basis for a second major debate.
In reality, what happens in Philadelphia is that the question of the apportionment of representation in the House of Representatives becomes the principal axis of dispute between the northern states and the southern states, or between the states which are eliminating slavery and those whose social systems are based on slavery. So the South was seeking some credit for slavery. Northern delegates argued that society's gotten too big for all the people to assemble and deliberate. Since slaves would never deliberate, there's no reason to factor them into any scheme of representation.
The next clause, as to 3/5 of the Negroes being considered, Mr. King, being much opposed to fixing numbers as the rule of representation, was particularly so on account of the blacks. He thought the admission of them, along with whites at all, would excite great discontents among the states having no slaves. Mr. Gouverneur Morris was compelled to declare himself reduced to the dilemma of doing injustice to the southern states or to human nature, and he must therefore do it to the former, for he could never agree to give such encouragement to the slave trade as would be given by allowing them a representation for their Negroes, and he did not believe those states would ever confederate on terms that would deprive them of that trade.
But the Southern delegates say, no, we'd be crazy to come into this union without getting a certain kind of credit, recognition of slavery. So the 3/5 clause in the Constitution are really a product of the Southerners' insistence that slavery has to be accommodated.
The report of the Committee of 11 being taken up, General Pinckney moved to strike out the words, "the year 1800," as the year limiting the importation of slaves, and to insert the words, "the year 1808." Mr. Gorham seconded the motion. Mr. Madison, 20 years will produce all the mischief that can be apprehended from the liberty to import slaves. So long a term will be more dishonorable to the American character than to say nothing about it in the Constitution. Motion passed, 7-4.
The compromise over slavery and determination of the structure of Congress took up most of the 4 months the convention was in session.
Now, let's ask the question, which of those sets of interests are more important to accommodate over the long run if you want to have a stable constitutional system, if you want to get it up and running, and you want to maintain it under conditions of stability for some time to come? Is it more important to conciliate small states and large states, or to conciliate free states and slave states? When we sit down and we compare the two kinds of compromises, the one that is a matter of morality we tend to think is the much more objectionable, the more offensive, because it seems to legitimate slavery. In a certain sense, in political terms, makes a lot more sense. And it's one that was really much more closely tied to the real politics that Americans will pursue over the coming decades. Whereas the difference between large and small states, which we see as this great heroic thing where, Connecticut gets 2 votes and New York gets 2 votes, I think is wrong as a matter of democratic theory, because it seems to be 1 person, 1 vote ought to be the guiding principle of democratic government. But it's also wrong as a matter of politics, because it doesn't really predict or doesn't really anticipate any real division which will take place in the polity thereafter.
Once these issues were resolved, there remained a final question. Would Americans not at the convention endorse the ideas of the framers?
I think one of the things we appreciate least about the adoption of the Constitution was how much it depended upon popular ratification, both as a matter of political strategy and as a matter of political theory. And it's important to distinguish those 2 things. As a matter of political strategy, the Articles of Confederation called for approval of all changes by the unanimous vote of all 13 state legislatures. But of course, only 12 states were represented in Philadelphia, and state legislatures themselves would arguably be the net losers in any realignment of power from the Articles to the new Constitution, or from the states to a stronger national government. So the framers had strong strategic reasons, or just let's say very expedient reasons, the reasons of political calculation, to come up with some other formula, some other scheme of ratification, or at least to abandon the Articles of Confederation framework, the 13 state legislature requirement, and come up with something else.
Mr. Sherman thought such a popular ratification unnecessary. The Articles of Confederation providing for changes and alterations with the assent of Congress and ratification of state legislatures.
But there's a deeper argument here, and the deeper argument is that, in fact, a constitution, to be fully constitutional, to acquire the status of supreme fundamental law, or should really be adopted through some direct expression of popular sovereignty. So the framers and the Continental Congress, which endorses the scheme, and the Federalists who support it, hit upon a very ingenious strategy, which is to say the people can approve the Constitution in toto, in its entirety, or they can reject it. But they can't approve it article by article, section by section, clause by clause. They can't approve it conditionally, where you would never have closure on this.
Mr. Madison thought this provision essential. The Articles of Confederation themselves were defective in this respect, resting in many of the states on...
So there's this very powerful conception. To make a constitution supreme law, it has to rest upon a direct expression of the popular voice. But when the people speak, they can't say too much. They really only have a choice between 1 and 0, yes and no.
But what strikes me at least, in trying to see the way in which they managed these problems, in the end was not their theoretical capacity, but their pragmatism. They drew on their immediate experiences in British North America, which was different from experiences of people concerned with these matters in Europe or in Britain itself. And they knew that in their local circumstances, in fact, there had been a federal arrangement as between the British government and the local assemblies. In fact, it was possible to get representation from distant areas in actual and not theoretical terms. And in fact, it did seem to them possible from their own experience to construct a kind of power system that nevertheless preserved individual liberties.
And as the framers left the Philadelphia Convention, how did they view their work and the Constitution's chance for acceptance by the country at large?
Whilst the last members were signing, Dr. Franklin, looking toward the president's chair, at the back of which a rising sun happened to be painted, observed to a few members near him that the painters had found it difficult to distinguish in their art a rising from a setting sun. "I have," said he, often and often in the course of the session, and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun.
On Common Ground, Framework for Democracy is a 26-part series about American government. For more information on this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.